I'm delighted to be here tonight exploring the issue of immigration and the fight for America's future. As an immigration historian, I regret to inform you that the place of immigrants in American society has always been a controversial topic, pitting America's idealized vision against our economic and racial fears. It is my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker this evening, someone who literally wrote the book on immigration law, Dr. Stephen Legomsky. Dr. Legomsky comes to us from Missouri, where he is the John Lehman University Professor Emeritus at Washington University School of Law. From 2011 to 2013, Professor Legomsky took a leave of absence from the university to serve as chief counsel of the Federal Immigration Services Agency in the Department of Homeland Security. After retiring in July 2015, he returned to Washington to serve as senior counselor to the Secretary of Homeland Security. He has been an advisor to both Democratic and Republican administrations, the United Nations High Commission for Refugees, and several foreign governments on immigration and refugee policies. His immigration course book, now in its 7th edition, has been the required text at 185 law schools. We should all be so lucky. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Professor Legomsky. Steve?
Well, thank you very much, Diane. Thank you as well to the Riley Institute, to the Osher Institute, to OLLI Furman University, and special thanks to Jill for her incredibly kind and thoughtful and super competent organizational efforts. This is my first time at Furman University. I was blown away when I first saw the campus. It's one of the most beautiful campuses I have ever seen, and so it's a delight and an honor for me to be here. There's also a special reason why I'm happy to be here, and that is that for the past 60 years, since age 10, I have been a lunatic, humorless Red Sox fan, and was able to score tickets to tomorrow night's drive game, which I'm really excited about. So my heartfelt thanks go out to all of you for inviting me. Just so you can pace yourselves, Jill has suggested that I drone on for about 30 minutes or so, and then take time for your questions and comments, tomatoes, any other airborne produce you might have with you, and we'll go from there. So here goes. The topic for this evening's session is immigration enforcement. But in order to talk comprehensively about immigration enforcement, I have to first give you a quick nutshell on the laws that we're talking about the enforcement of. So here in a few minutes is what it takes me 42 hours of class time to cover a portion of at the law school. Immigration in a nutshell. First of all, a general comment about U.S. immigration law. It is fiendishly complicated. The main statute, the law passed by Congress that governs immigration in the U.S., was first passed in 1952 during the height of the Cold War. It has been amended, however, literally more than 100 times since then. So it has now grown into this hideous 600-page monster that is replete with ambiguities and contradictions, weird anomalies, and so forth. In addition to these pages of statute, there are now thousands and thousands of pages of federal regulations and judicial precedent decisions, as well as informal government policy memos. And to make this a little bit more interesting, this entire structure seems to change almost every day, literally. So it's hard to keep up with. So here is U.S. immigration law in as quick a nutshell as I can put it. Part of immigration law is citizenship law. Who gets to be a citizen of the United States, for example? There are at least two reasons that citizenship law is at the core of immigration law. One is that U.S. citizens are entirely immune from the immigration laws. If you're a U.S. citizen, you can come and go as you please, and you can never be deported, no matter how repulsive you might personally be. You know who you are. In addition to that, though, U.S. citizens have all kinds of legal opportunities to bring in their close family members. And so for both of these reasons, the first question to ask in any immigration system is, who gets to be a citizen? Well, around the world, two venerable principles have informed for centuries now the question of how you can automatically become a citizen at the very moment of birth. And I know these principles are venerable because they have Latin names. One of them is jus soli, S-O-L-I. Literally, it means rights from the land. This emanated historically from the English feudal system at a time when land ownership enjoyed real primacy in terms of defining people's legal rights. And the idea behind jus soli is that you automatically become, at birth, a citizen of the country in whose territory you are born. The other venerable principle is called jus sanguinis. This means right of the blood. This came mainly from the European continent, and the idea behind jus sanguinis is that under certain circumstances you can inherit the citizenship of one or both of your parents. As a practical matter today, there are very few nations in the world, if any, that adopt either one of these two principles in absolute form. What really happens in practice is that most nations' laws reflect a combination of modified versions of these two principles. So that's who gets to be a citizen. You should also be aware, by the way, that even if you are a U.S. citizen, you can lose your U.S. citizenship. We can talk about that in the Q&A if you would like. But let's assume from this point on that you're not a citizen, you're a foreign national, and you want to immigrate to the U.S. How can you do it? The first thing I need to do is dispel a very common myth. The myth is that as long as there's nothing affirmatively wrong with you, and you're willing to wait your turn in line, then you can become a citizen, then you can immigrate to the United States. That sounds reasonable, but that is not the law. In order to immigrate legally to the United States, you have to affirmatively fit yourself within one of a small number of very specific affirmative categories or pigeonholes created by Congress. Today, there are four main categories of people whom the U.S. admits legally as immigrants. The largest category consists of people who are coming for the purpose of reuniting with certain close family members specified in the statute who are either U.S. citizens or lawful permanent residents. A second large category is people who immigrate on the basis of certain occupational credentials that enable them to contribute to the U.S. labor force because they're needed in the labor force. A third large category, but not much smaller than the first two, is the so-called visa lottery that you might have read about. This is a special program for nationals of certain specific countries that have sent relatively few immigrants to the U.S. in the past 5 years. And the fourth major category is refugees. There are a handful, if there are any immigration lawyers in the audience, you know there are a handful of much smaller miscellaneous categories. But the key point is that if you do not fall within one of these categories, then you cannot legally immigrate to the United States, no matter how wonderful you might be, period. The reason I'm giving this point so much emphasis is that in the debates over undocumented immigrants, it's common to hear people say things like, you know, these people should just go home, apply through regular legal channels, and then wait their turn in line like everybody else. Often this claim is followed by something like, just as my grandparents did. They came in the right way. Well, based on what I've said, I hope it's clear now that for the vast majority of our undocumented immigrants, it's not a question of applying through regular legal channels or waiting their turn in line. They would be delighted to do that. The problem they face is that for them, there simply is no line to wait in. Okay? A second major principle of U.S. immigration law is that even if you fall within one of these qualifying categories, you also have to prove that you do not fall with any of a long list of disqualifications. This list takes up more than 20 pages of small print in the statute, all the reasons you can't come in. Most of them are not surprising. They relate to things like criminal history, dangers to national security, financial self-sufficiency, public health reasons. Many of the disqualifications relate to problems with the immigration process itself. Maybe you committed a fraud, maybe you don't have the right documents, etc. And the last point to make about the U.S. admission program is that assuming you fit within one of the qualifying categories, And assuming further you don't fall with any of these so-called inadmissibility grounds, there are, with some important exceptions, numerical limits on the number of people who may come to the U.S. as immigrants in any single fiscal year in any single one of these categories. Also, there are additional numerical limits on the number who may come in any given category in any given year from any one source country. The practical combination of these limits has generated waiting periods that for most categories of immigrants are measured in years rather than in months. One last program that I need to say a few words about is the refugee admissions program. And here I have to explain the U.S. really has two different refugee programs simultaneously in place. One of those programs is for overseas refugees, meaning people who are overseas and they apply to the appropriate U.S. authorities for admission to the United States. The way that program works is that by statute, the president decides every year how many such refugees we will admit and from where. This is a huge issue today because President Trump has reduced the overall limit to the lowest it has been in the 38-year history of the program, and this has happened at precisely the time that the world refugee population is by far at an all-time record high. So this policy has caused real humanitarian concerns around the world. The other refugee program is for people who have already managed to make it to the U.S. somehow on their own, either at a port of entry or at the border or at the interior of the United States, and they apply for protection once they reach U.S. territory. This is the program popularly known as asylum. For either of these programs, you have to prove that you meet the technical legal definition of the word refugee. And that definition is narrower than you might have assumed. In order to be a refugee under U.S. law, and this is generally true internationally as well, you have to show that you have what is called a well-founded fear, something the courts have interpreted to mean an objectively reasonable fear, that if you are sent back, you will be persecuted because of one of 5 specific reasons. And those reasons are your race, your religion, your nationality, your political opinion, or your membership in what is called a particular social group, a technical term that I'll come back to in a moment. And before I go any further, I'm just going to throw a question out to you. Thinking about that list, race, religion, nationality, political opinion, social group, is there any classification that you might have expected to see on that list, especially if you're familiar with civil rights legislation, that doesn't appear on that list? Just shout it out if you can think of it. No? Religion's on there. Gender. Gender is not on that list, and that means that for women who are fleeing domestic violence or who are fleeing female genital mutilation or who are fleeing mass rape in time of war or are fleeing from gang rape at the hands of criminal gangs, or women who are going to be subjected to honor killings if they return, they are relegated to having to find some indirect legal argument to support their case. Typically, the argument is that we qualify as a member of some particular social group. The problem is that just weeks ago, Attorney General Jeff Sessions announced that from this point on, women fleeing domestic violence, as well as anybody fleeing gang violence, will not qualify as a particular social group and therefore will not receive asylum in the United States. This is particularly problematic today because, as you might know from the news, the vast majority of the Central American mothers and children who are arriving at our southern border are making one of those 2 claims, gang violence or domestic violence. So this has become a big issue. And finally, in the way of recap, one word on the federal agencies that implement all of these immigration laws. The responsibilities have changed several times over the past roughly 100 years, but for several decades leading up to 9/11, the agency in charge of immigration was the Immigration and Naturalization Service, or the INS. They were housed within the Justice Department, and they had 2 basic functions. One was service or benefits, that is, they would process applications that you file for a legal immigration status. And in addition, they were in charge of enforcement. Well, 9/11 happened, and Congress decided to make 2 fundamental changes to this structure. One was to create this new Department of Homeland Security, DHS, and to transfer to it almost all of the responsibilities previously performed by the old INS. The second change, however, is within DHS, Congress made a deliberate decision to split up the benefits function and the enforcement function. So today there are actually 3 different immigration agencies within DHS. There is U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, the agency I worked for. They are the Services and Benefits Agency. There is Immigration and Customs Enforcement, popularly known as ICE, which is generally responsible for enforcement of the immigration laws in the interior of the country. And then there is there's Customs and Border Protection, or CBP, which is generally responsible for enforcement in the border areas. So with that whirlwind primer on immigration law, let me turn to the subject of enforcement. I'm going to start by throwing some numbers at you. There are, by most demographers' agreement, somewhere between 10.5 and 11 million undocumented immigrants living today in the United States. And this number has stayed really very flat for about 9 years or so. If anything, it has very slightly decreased. Over roughly the past, and by the way, that sounds like a large number, it's about 1 for every 30 Americans. Over roughly the past, it stayed constant for about 9 years. Who are these folks? Well, some more numbers. About 86% of the undocumented immigrants have lived in the U.S. more than 5 years. About 60% have lived here more than 10 years, and more than half have lived here more than 20 years. Since the year 2000, the number of people trying to enter the U.S. illegally has dramatically dropped from an average of about 1.7 million back in 2000 to about 300,000 today. Slightly more than half of the undocumented population is from Mexico, although in the last couple of years or so, Central Americans have slightly overtaken Mexicans in terms of border apprehensions. Where in the U.S. do they settle? More than half of our undocumented immigrants settled in 4 states. In order, they are California, Texas, Florida, and New York. Interestingly, however, at least it's interesting to me, it might be boring to you, but interestingly, the 7 fastest growing undocumented populations are all in southern states, including, by the way, South Carolina, which houses the 2nd fastest growing undocumented population. Part of this, I think, is because there has also been a migration of undocumented immigrants from the cities to the suburbs, largely because manufacturing jobs in the cities have fallen off at the same time that the suburbs are hiring more in the way of house cleaning, home construction, and other jobs that undocumented immigrants disproportionately do. Undocumented immigrants tend to be young. About half are under age 35. Only about 6% are over 55. This, by the way, has proved to be a real lifeline that has kept the Social Security system afloat, not only because they're young, but also because they pay into the system, even though they're undocumented, but they are ineligible to receive the retirement benefits once they retire. Despite some of the political rhetoric, the crime rate has been shown by study after study after study. The crime rate among undocumented immigrants has been shown to be significantly lower than the crime rate among native-born citizens. So that ironically, if you think about it, undocumented immigrants have actually lowered the U.S. crime rate. They haven't lowered it to 0, though. In any population of 11 million, you're going to get a certain number of bad apples. And what we've unfortunately seen, unfortunate in my view, is that when a violent crime is committed and it turns out that the perpetrator happened to be an undocumented immigrant, we do have politicians who will exploit that tragedy and make it sound as if the immigration system or immigrants generally are to blame. As for the economic impact of illegal immigration, this gets very complicated, and Dean Peterson, I think, will address this subject with much more sophistication than I can when he speaks next week. But I'll just tell you generally, the 2 main economic issues have been what is their fiscal impact and what is their impact on the job market. As for fiscal impact, most economists now seem to agree that it's pretty much a wash, maybe a slight positive or a slight negative if you combine all levels of government's budgets, federal, all state budgets, and all local budgets. That's because immigrants do pay into undocumented immigrants do pay into the system. They do tend to pay less in taxes on average because they have low incomes than native-born Americans do, but at the same time, because they are ineligible for almost all welfare programs, they cost less as well. I can't make the same statement, though, about individual states. In many states, it must be acknowledged that undocumented immigrants are a net negative when it comes to fiscal. And that's because even though they do pay state income taxes and property taxes and sales taxes and gasoline taxes, at the same time, like anybody else living in the state, they generate additional expenditures. And for most states, the big ticket item really is elementary and secondary education. As for impact on the labor market, this too is hard to gauge, and it doesn't fall equally on every sector of the public. But generally speaking, that's probably close to a wash because undocumented immigrants do, of course, take jobs, but also, like anybody living here, they consume jobs in the same way that everybody in this room does, by consuming goods and resources. They also sometimes help to keep marginal enterprises that also employ Americans afloat. So that's close to a wash. As for economic growth, I think there is a general consensus among mainstream economists that immigration has a positive effect on long-term economic growth. And as for the overall picture on the resources we spend on enforcement, in the last couple of decades, the amounts spent on immigration enforcement have truly skyrocketed. The Border Patrol budget is now 14 times what it was in 1990. The ICE budget for interior enforcement has roughly tripled since the year 2004. We now spend more money on immigration enforcement, by the way, than on all federal law enforcement programs combined. That's an overview of enforcement. Before turning to the specific hot issues on enforcement, I also want to put them in context by pointing out, just in a single long-winded sentence, some of the important legal immigration issues that also arise, because it's not all about enforcement. But these include, and now I'm going to have to really look at my notes to remember this list, the travel ban, the President's calls for a roughly 50% reduction to the family unification program, which he calls chain migration, the proposed elimination of the visa lottery program, a proposed points system for admitting immigrants, massive cuts to the refugee program, as I've mentioned, the new policy of denying asylum to people fearing domestic violence and gang violence, as I've also mentioned, and the termination of previous grants of this program called Temporary Protected Status, or TPS. I mentioned earlier in the definition of refugee that you can't get asylum on the base if the only harm you fear is something like the crossfire of a civil war or natural disaster. It's only if you fear persecution, and then only if the persecution is on one of the 5 protected grounds. But we do have a temporary program where people who are already here may, in the discretion of the Homeland Security Secretary, be designated as being from a country that it is too dangerous to return to. The Trump administration has been canceling these grants of I shouldn't say canceling, has been non-renewing these grants of temporary protected status at every turn. So that has become an issue as well. So with that introduction, here are some bare bones descriptions of a list of what I think of as 7 hot immigration enforcement issues that have arisen in recent times and which have featured prominently in the news. The first is what the Trump administration calls a zero tolerance policy. I'll have to spend a little more time on this one because it actually affects all of the other policies. Here's the background. Under even the most ambitious scenario possible, and even with the massive resources that we are now investing in immigration enforcement, the reality is that those resources are enough to enable the administration, any administration, to go after, at most, maybe 4% of the undocumented population. Even that, many people consider to be a stretch. So there have to be priorities. As to priorities, there have been 2 different philosophies. President Obama's philosophy, which I'm most familiar with from being part of that process, was that we should prioritize the removal of people whose crimes make them a danger to public safety, people who might be a threat to national security, people who are apprehended at the border while in the process of attempting to enter illegally, and people apprehended even in the interior who have been in the U.S. only a very short time. Prioritizing some, though, with limited resources means you have to deprioritize others. And so the groups President Obama decided to deprioritize are, 1, people who have lived peaceful and productive lives in the U.S. for a long period of time, and also people whose deportations would result in the breakup of families, especially as is often the case if those families consist of U.S. citizens as well as immigrants. President Trump, in contrast, has taken a different view. In theory, he has also embraced the priority for removing criminal defendants, but he has rendered all of these priorities meaningless by instructing all Border Patrol officers and all ICE officers that they should go after anybody they find who appears to be undocumented. And I have major concerns about this process. Since I just saw that I have only a few minutes left, I won't tell you what those concerns are unless somebody asks about them during the Q&A. Okay, 10 minutes. So I'll mention a couple of them there. One of them is that by leaving the department's priorities in the hands of individual officers, you're letting each officer decide what he or she personally thinks the department's priorities ought to be, and that leads to incredible inconsistency. It means, among other things, that whether you are deported is going to depend on which officer you happen to encounter in the field and which prosecutor's desk your file happens to land on. Beyond that, I believe that setting priorities is an extremely important policy decision. And in a democracy, we rightly expect important policy decisions to be made by agency leadership and not by the rank and file, because it's the leadership that can be held politically accountable. On top of that, this emphasis on zero enforcement has exacerbated what is already a multi-year backlog in the immigration courts. And in addition, because zero tolerance means not only we're going to put people in removal proceedings, but also we will bring criminal charges in addition, it has taken resources away from what I would have thought are more serious border crimes like drug trafficking and weapons trafficking and human trafficking. Beyond that, some of the cruelties that arise are simply inexplicable. And I have to give you an example, because I can't sleep at night without thinking about little Rosa Maria Hernandez, whom some of you might have been reading about in the papers. She and her family are undocumented immigrants. They live in Laredo, Texas, a border town. She was brought here at the age of 3 months as a baby with cerebral palsy. That's why her parents came. They hoped she could get treatment for her cerebral palsy. She's also developmentally disabled. They've been here about 10 years now, and she has the cognitive abilities of a 5 to 6-year-old. On top of all this, one day she has a gallbladder attack, and she needs emergency surgery. Her parents are undocumented, and the only route to a hospital from where they lived forced them to go through a Border Patrol checkpoint. So her parents could not go with her, or they would be immediately picked up and deported. Luckily, she had a U.S. citizen cousin, a teenager, who went with them. They get to the border station. They're asked for their papers. Of course, she doesn't have any. And the Border Patrol holds up the car for 30 minutes, in the process trying to persuade them they should turn the car around and go back to Mexico and find emergency surgery there. There was a standoff. Eventually, the Border Patrol relented. The car proceeded to the hospital. The Border Patrol followed her all the way. They stationed themselves outside her hospital room until she was discharged the following morning, at which point they took her away, charging her with being undocumented. Now, normally, when an undocumented child is found in the U.S., the practice, and in fact it's ordered by a court settlement order, is to unite the child with the parents while she is waiting for removal or removal proceedings. But in this case, and that's true even if the parents are undocumented, in this case, for reasons they have still never explained, they locked her up in a detention facility, a jail, hundreds of miles from her parents. And luckily, a reporter found out about this, and there was such a national uproar that after 2 weeks, they released her, and she is now home. But she is not home free because they are still not saying whether they will institute removal proceedings. I wish I could tell you that this were an isolated case. There's another case involving a woman who's been here 24 years. She's the mother of 4 U.S. citizen children, one of whom has Down syndrome and who is dependent on her for his daily needs. She was locked up and deported. And there are just case after case about this that the public is not often aware of. I happen to know about them because in my work, I talk to lots of immigration lawyers, but I think this is what happens when you entrust these decisions to the unbridled discretion of individual officers in the field. And here I want to be clear, I'm not indicting the entire Border Patrol. I have no doubt that there are many Border Patrol agents, maybe most, who do act with professionalism and common sense and even a dose of humanity from time to time. But there are so many who don't, and incidents like this are heartbreaking and I think truly unnecessary. Anyway, now I'll run to the other hot issues very quickly. One thing that the zero tolerance policy has given rise to, and you're all familiar with this, is the family separation policy. The idea here is that in order to discourage people from fleeing violence and coming to the U.S. in the first place, the strategy is you take the children away from the parents, put the children in jail, then you charge the parents with a criminal offense, and based on the criminal offense, you send the parents to a distant jail while they await their criminal charges. On top of all this, the administration has rightly been faulted, I think, for failing even to keep adequate records of which children go with which parents, so that eventual reunification, even after a court order, has become very difficult. There are still several hundred parents whom they have not been able to locate. Many of them were deported to Central America without their children. And in many cases, it's just come out in the last few days, the reason they accepted deportation in the first place, rather than fight their cases and pursue their asylum claims, is that Border Patrol officers threatened them that if they did not go back, they would never see their children again. The administration's position is the ACLU, which brought the lawsuit challenging this practice, should be responsible for going out and finding these parents. The judge said, forget it, you are responsible. As it turns out, the administration still is doing very little to find them, and the ACLU has recruited resources and people to go out and find these folks, but it's a very dire situation. A third big issue, which you've all heard about repeatedly, is the wall. Mixed feelings that people have in the wall. It's very costly. It's not just the cost of constructing it. You also have to acquire all the land along the border. It's private land. You have to seize it by eminent domain. You have to build construction roads along the wall for the construction trucks. And then after all this is done, there are annual maintenance costs. So it's probably roughly $32 billion to construct it, plus however much it costs per year after that. On the other hand, there are many who feel that this is the most effective way to reduce illegal immigration. So you have to balance those two considerations. A fourth issue relates to the so-called sanctuary cities. I should explain, sanctuary is not a technical legal term. It's a generic term that people use in different ways, typically, though, to describe states and cities and municipalities and towns whose policy is that we are not going to expend our resources to affirmatively assist the federal government in its immigration enforcement efforts beyond what the law requires. Now, there is a law that requires states and local authorities, if they happen to have information already on a given individual immigrant and they know that the person is undocumented, and if ICE requests that information, they must share it. But nothing in the law requires any jurisdiction to look for that information in the first place, nor does it require jurisdictions, even upon a request from ICE, to hold that person in jail beyond that person's normal release date. So jurisdictions that do not go beyond the law have been labeled sanctuary cities, and the sheriff who is here with us today will be much more of an expert on that than I am. Another issue concerns the so-called 287G agreements, in which our sheriff is also an expert. These are agreements Congress has authorized in which state and local law enforcement agencies may enter into agreements with the federal government whereby state and local officials who are designated and trained may perform certain specific immigration officer functions like investigating, apprehending, arresting, detaining, and in some cases, depending on the particular agreement, even instituting removal proceedings. They have both pros and cons, and there's a lot of difference of opinion about 287G. A sixth hot issue on enforcement is employer sanctions. In 1986, Congress passed a law that made it impose civil fines, and in extreme cases, criminal punishment on employers who knowingly hire foreign nationals who are not authorized to work. It also requires every employer to affirmatively verify the identity and the work authorization of everyone they hire, even U.S. citizens. There's a program called E-Verify that some of you might be aware of, which enables employers at their option right now to go online and verify the person's identity and work authorization. There are issues with E-Verify. There are both pros and cons, and there are bills pending in Congress that would make this binding, a mandatory process for all employers. And the last issue, which I wish I had a whole day to discuss, is DACA. I had the honor of being the chief counsel of USCIS, which is the agency that implements DACA, at the time we rolled it out, and we were all very excited about it. DACA was an attempt by President Obama to do as much as he could in light of Congress's decision not to pass a much broader DREAM Act, which would have given a path to U.S. citizenship for certain undocumented immigrants who had been brought here as children and who had lived in the U.S. for a certain period of time, had clean records, et cetera, et cetera. President Obama couldn't do legally what the DREAM Act did. He has no authority to provide a legal status or a path to citizenship, but the government can do, and has done for decades, and what President Obama did with DACA was to say, what we will do for those who qualify is give you a 2-year reprieve from removal as part of our prosecutorial priorities. We will also, during that 2-year period, pursuant to a formal regulation adopted actually by the Reagan administration decades ago, we will allow you to work temporarily during that specific period. So far, something like 800,000 young people have received DACA. But last September, President Trump rescinded DACA for the stated reason that he believed it to be illegal. There followed a whole series of lawsuits. So far, 3 federal courts have now held DACA is perfectly legal, and not only that, but the way in which you terminated it was illegal, for reasons that, again, I can elaborate on in the Q&A if you would like. The complication is that the state of Texas, joined by several other states, including South Carolina, by the way, has filed a separate lawsuit against the state of Texas, asking the court to order precisely the opposite. They want the court to order the government to stop processing DACA applications because they believe that it is illegal. That's still pending, and I guess in the interest of full disclosure, I should mention that I have been asked by the parties in the court, the parties defending DACA, to serve as the main expert witness in that case. So I am currently serving in that capacity, and my views are obviously biased on that issue, as well as all the ones I've discussed already. I do expect this case to wind up at the Supreme Court. That's my prediction. And by the way, I should ask you, I mentioned as an aside, you really should pay very careful attention to my predictions because, with all due humility, they are truly remarkable. No, this is really true. Not to brag, but I was one of the very first people in America to predict that in 1972, Ed Muskie would be elected president. Okay, that's my self-effacing humor for the evening. I want to finish by stating the obvious, not to sound too self-righteous, but immigration excites passions, always has, always will. I like to emphasize why people immigrate to this great country. Many people come here for the purpose of reuniting, often after long periods of separation, with their husbands or their wives, or their children, or their parents, or U.S. citizens. Many come for the kinds of life opportunities that they and their children could never dream of in their countries of origin. Many people, tragically, have to come here in order to escape persecution, or torture, or even death. And as I mentioned, we now have this terribly sad saga of thousands of Central American mothers and children coming here to escape violence at the hands of the gangs back home who are waiting to kill them, rape them, or torture them. This is a large audience, so I'm guessing that statistically there are some immigrants in this group. In fact, I know of one. But for those of you who are not immigrants, I would like to ask you to temporarily imagine yourself as an immigrant. In fact, I'm going to ask you to close your eyes, either literally or figuratively, whichever, depending on how comfortable you are with your neighbor, and try to visualize what it would be like if you were suddenly uprooted from the only country you have ever known. You're going to leave your neighbors, you're going to leave your friends, you're going to leave your family members behind. Maybe never to see them again, you don't know. And you're going to travel, often alone, to a distant land with a language that you might not speak or understand, and a strange culture, and strange new surroundings, and a totally uncertain future. You have absolutely no idea what is going to become of you in this new life. This is not a natural human impulse, and yet that is precisely what so many of our neighbors, authorized and unauthorized, did. It took uncommon courage. It took uncommon initiative. And yet they did it. This is the stuff that immigrants and refugees are made of. And in my view, it is why immigrants have been able to contribute and enrich so much our country economically, culturally, spiritually, and in so many other ways. And I know from my own experiences with immigrants and refugees that the vast majority of those who succeed are proud to become Americans and grateful to the country that has given them a second chance in life. Thank you all very much.
for that wonderful and very provocative speech. I'd like to open it up now. We have about a few minutes, at least 5 to 7 minutes for questions. So I invite you to ask questions of Steve, and he'll be happy to answer them. Over there. Yeah.
Hi, I have a question on H-1B visas, and that I worked in microelectronics in Silicon Valley with a lot of, and was working with the new hire program. My company hired mostly master's degree students that come from all over the world to get their master's in the U.S. generally, and then if they get laid off, like there was a big layoff in our division, and a lot of these people had something like 2 months to find another job after we had brought them as new college hires, and they'd been working there 2 years, 4 years, whatever years, and they're taking their training, have to take their training back to a country that may or may not do microelectronics. Why would we be sending these people away so quickly after we've worked very hard to acquire them?
Yeah, that's a very good question. For those who are not familiar with the program, H-1B visas are for people who are coming to the United States to do temporary, typically professional type work, and there are a series of technical requirements for them. H-1Bs have been controversial. On the one hand, most U.S. employers will say we really do need their skills. Even at a time of high unemployment, there's not always a perfect fit between Americans willing to take the jobs and the supply of people and the demand for those jobs. So it's been great to admit some of those individuals. Many people who take H-1B visas are hoping that at the end of the period, which is usually 6 or 7 years, by then they will be able to qualify for a permanent resident visa, that is a green card. But it doesn't always work out that way because green card visas, I should say green cards are limited numerically. And the reason it's been so controversial, I think, is that on the one hand, industry needs these workers, even if they're temporary. And on the other hand, you don't want undue competition with the U.S. domestic labor force. So there have been different philosophies. There are many people who also say, this is analogous to the question you've asked, why don't we make more of an effort to take foreign students who usually have really impressive credentials in the United States, especially postgraduate students, and hire them into permanent jobs where they could become permanent residents. But again, there's always this tension that runs throughout the immigration laws, not just for H-1Bs, between protecting the American workforce and helping industry find the people it needs and helping consumers be able to buy products at reasonable prices. So I'm sorry I can't give you a clear answer to that question, but those, I think, are some of the competing factors.
I had the good fortune to get to go to the border earlier this year and to talk both with Border Patrol agents and people on both sides, because I was living in Mexico and crossing the border 3 or 4 times every day, it seems like. One of the things I want to know, I was just curious whether you ever, 2 things we heard particularly from a not to be named Border Patrol group, that they had put forward in their division and on up the steps that they didn't want. The wall was not their request. Instead was modern technology and helicopters and that type of thing. Felt like the cost was much less. Secondly, that the cartels, and they actually could point and show me breaks in the trees where the cartels were set up with a lot better electronics than we had on our side, and were therefore able to know when they were going to be agents and what places. Are you aware of any kind of requests that came through the Border Patrol saying we don't want that? I realize it wouldn't have probably made it quite into the West Wing. But.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I had not heard of that request. I have heard, though, that the Border Patrol agents are divided over the effectiveness of a wall. I'll just tell you one quick anecdote. Back in the 90s, I was an advisor to President George H.W. Bush's Commissioner of Immigration. We'd have monthly meetings, and one of these meetings occurred in San Diego. The commissioner had just begun construction of a border fence, not a concrete wall, but a fence. And he was very proud of it. He had not seen it yet, so we took a trip out there. We had a helicopter view of the border at night, and then he saw the border in action for the first time as we were traveling in a Border Patrol Jeep on the U.S. side of the road, parallel to the fence. And what he saw, to his horror, was that as we progressed along the fence, you would see people climbing to the top of the fence and using the fence as a vantage point for determining whether La Migra, as they called the Border Patrol, were on board. And occasionally you'd see people going like this, which meant, okay, it's all clear. And occasionally you'd see people going like this, indicating it's not clear. So there are real questions about the effectiveness of a wall. The other thing I have to mention about a wall is that about half of our undocumented population entered legally on temporary visas and then overstayed. A wall can't prevent that at all. All this said, I myself don't think that the idea of a wall is reprehensible. I know there are people who feel that symbolically it is an awful thing. I don't feel that it's symbolically awful. A country does have the right to protect its borders. I do have serious questions, however, about the cost-benefit analysis. In addition to that, in addition to the fact that it costs a lot of money and there's some doubt about how much it would really accomplish, it can cause tragedy. Once the U.S. began fortifying the southern border with walls, what happened, and there are many studies to confirm this empirically, is that naturally the wall would be constructed in the places where the greatest numbers of people seek to enter illegally. That would be normal. But what that meant was that the people would then be diverted to entering the less popular points, and the reason those points were less popular was that they were physically more dangerous. And as a result, there are now hundreds and hundreds of deaths every year on the border from people drowning in the Rio Grande, from people falling off precipitous terrain, dying of heat stroke and thirst in the desert. Many of these are children. So there are real humanitarian costs. I'll just add, too, a couple studies have come out showing that once the wall, when a wall or a fence goes up, what happens is not that fewer people try to come. What happens is that people who are already here decide not to go back and forth because the cost of returning and therefore probably having to hire a smuggler goes way up. So for all these reasons, I'm skeptical about the benefits of a wall, but I don't write it off entirely because I think as a nation, we have the right to have some type of physical barrier on the border.
Okay, I think we've got time for just one more question.
So recently I've heard lots of calls for the abolishment of ICE, and I'm just kind of wondering if you think that is practical at all, and if not, what aspect of immigration law would be most effective to change and practical and realistic to change to make America a more welcoming country to people trying to find refuge here?
The first half of your question is easier to answer, I think. I'm not a fan of the idea of abolishing ICE. It's not because I think ICE is wonderful. They have been guilty of far too many abuses. But I don't think anyone could seriously recommend that we not have any immigration law enforcement at all. And therefore, if ICE were abolished, the real question is what we would replace it with. And there often has been some ambiguity on that score. I can't think of any reason to assume that a new interior enforcement agency that replaces ICE would be any better or any worse in terms of respecting human rights than ICE is. And for that reason, I'm not sure it makes that much sense from a policy standpoint. I have serious questions about whether it's a politically strategic position as well. But for those reasons, I'm not a big fan of it. The second part of your question, I think, would require a few days' worth of discussion. And that is, how can we make America a more welcoming place? And I personally believe that what we could really use is the kind of comprehensive immigration reform package, which the Senate actually passed overwhelmingly in 2013. We were working on that diligently. The White House was very much on board. It passed the Senate by an overwhelming bipartisan vote of 68 to 32. Not too many bills passed the Senate, especially in this area, by that margin. All the experienced, seasoned vote counters on Capitol Hill were very confident that if the bill were brought to a vote in the House, it would easily garner a majority. It would get practically all the Democrats and easily enough Republicans to make it over the top. But the Tea Party came to Speaker Boehner. They invoked the so-called Hastert rule, which is we don't allow anybody to vote on anything unless it has a majority of the majority party. And they made very clear to Speaker Boehner that if this goes to a House vote, which they knew would pass, his speakership was over. You can probably guess the ending. He did not allow the House to vote on it, and the bill died, and that's really what gave rise to DACA. But I personally believe that comprehensive immigration reform, which, by the way, would have taken the already massive enforcement resources we already spend and roughly tripled them again, as well as provide legalization to a chunk of the current undocumented population and reform the legal immigration laws, should have been an approach that would appeal, with some reservations, to people of all political stripes, but we just weren't able to get it through.
Thank you so much, Steve. Please join me in thanking Steve. Now I'd like to welcome to the stage 3 people who have been engaged with the impact of immigration law and policy and enforcement on local communities. Gary, Neil, and Akan, please join me on the stage. Okay, thank you for being here. Allow me to introduce you all briefly to the audience, and then we'll start our discussion. First, State Representative Neil Collins is a Republican from Easley. He has served in the State House since 2014 and has been an active member on the Children's Committee. As a result of meeting with Dreamers, young people who were brought to the United States as undocumented children, attended American schools, and hoping to gain a legal status across the state, Representative Collins joined with other committee members to introduce a bill in the state legislature to allow these DACA-eligible young people more educational and career opportunities. Next, we have Gary McFadden, to my right, a 36-year veteran of the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department. He has investigated more than 800 homicides, 90% of which were solved. He is now sheriff-elect of Mecklenburg County, in large part because he vowed to end 287G, which our speaker spoke about, which authorizes state and local police officers to collaborate with the federal government to enforce federal immigration laws. Finally, we are joined by our very own Dr. Akan Malichi, who has taught international politics at Furman since 2005. Born and raised in Germany by Turkish and Albanian parents, he came to the U.S. in 2000 and became a U.S. citizen in 2009. Apart from his teaching and scholarship, Akan has written editorials, organized rallies, and spoken at many various venues on behalf of immigrants. Thank you all for being here. Okay, now I'm going to move over here and start the questioning. Representative Collins, I'd like to begin with you. You've heard a lot about the Dreamers, and we know that Congress has been unable to pass legislation to provide legal status for these young people. You feel strongly that South Carolina needs to pass legislation to support this group of young immigrants, even though they came into the country undocumented. What can you tell us about your proposed legislation, and what do you want the people in the audience to know about South Carolina Dreamers?
Well, thank you, and good evening. First, want to say thank you to Riley Institute and to Furman for hosting this series. I'm a proud alum and continue to be a proud alum. To the students, I know y'all are in your second day. I know you're working on a CLE probably. I'm still working on mine, but thank you for being here. And to the OLLI participants, quite frankly, I can't wait to be an OLLI participant. I'm gonna be right there along with you. I'm here tonight to represent 7,000 South Carolina. I don't call them dreamers anymore. I just went through a tough primary, and apparently dreamers is becoming a bad word. What did work, though, was that they are legal residents. And I want to be a voice for them. I serve on, one of the committees that I serve on is the Children's Committee. And every fall we take a public input meetings, and y'all are welcome to come. We have our first one coming up in Greenville in September. Please come and advocate for those legal residents that we have in our state. But they only represent about even less than 10% of undocumented immigrants here. But I'm here specifically, and what I'm working on is to at least move the ball forward for those that we should all be in agreement upon. We didn't really get too far into it, but those legal status dreamers, to keep it easy for us, they go through background check every 2 years, fingerprinting. They have to prove that they are working in school or in the military. They also pay $500 every 2 years. They can't have any criminal record in between time or before. These are the cream of the cream, and I was very blessed that after our bill that we introduced last November, that one of my, not constituents, but one of my legal status citizens spoke up, and she's here tonight, so I just want to recognize her as well. But Sarah Batista, if you'll stand. Ms. Batista gave me so much cover locally and showed me what courage is, because again, going towards closing your eyes again, I can't imagine what she went through, even though I was recently told the somewhat full story at a Rotary meeting. But just inspiring, and going back to what makes an American, to me it has nothing to do with blood or land. It's all about ideal and who we are as Americans, and what we stand for. And those 4 freedoms that FDR spoke about, I saw it in that testimony. I asked a group to ensure that legal status dreamers would come and speak to our committee, and I was expecting 1 or 2 of the 7,000 to show up. 30 legal status dreamers came and told us their stories, and you can imagine what they've gone through. But just real quickly, to sort of touch on the 3 issues that the proposed bill talked about. Number 1, we had 2 recent valedictorians of our high schools. They were and are dreamers, and one is now at Wake Forest, because it was cheaper to go to a private school like Wake Forest out of state rather than keeping her in state. When we're South Carolina and we're one of the impoverished states, there's no reason we should leave or lose our talent purely because of some policy decision. We also heard from a number of dreamers that wanted to go to continue their education, and very important in this, and part of the fiscal reason for me, is we invest in these students and these children $12,000 or so a year when they're in K through 12. And then all of a sudden we say, in South Carolina, unfortunately, we say, you're not an in-state resident, and you're going to have to pay out-of-state or even worse, international rates. So 2 to 4 times the rates. So we heard those. Again, we're stifling their opportunity. But then worse, some took to the extreme of even paying those fees, and then not finding out until midway or on completion of their higher education that they in South Carolina could not do what they were trained to do, become any occupational license. And we have 40-something occupations in South Carolina that require a licensing degree. Nursing was big, teaching was big, and it just so happens in South Carolina we need nurses and teachers. So from a policymaker standpoint, hearing from them gave me courage, and I hope that we can move the ball a little bit farther than we did this past year, and I just appreciate y'all's help in helping us move that ball.
Thank you. I'm happy to report that I had a dreamer in my American Immigration History course several years ago. He was sweating it for a long period of time. He got through Furman, graduated, went on to graduate school, obtained his legal citizenship, and is now working in public policy in California. So there are some wonderful success stories out there. Okay, my next question is for Gary. The American people hear a lot about the connection of crime and immigrants, gang-related crimes, and homicides. What has your experience been as a 36-year veteran of law enforcement? And how has enforcement policy of the current administration affected your ability as a law enforcement officer?
Thank you. Make sure this works. Thank you. And I also thank Furman University for inviting me. I almost was a student here back in the 70s. I am from South Carolina, so I love home from Sumter, South Carolina. So, and this is very easy for me, and I love to travel and talk about this wonderful topic because we are in a time of understanding and misunderstanding. And so when they ask me from a law enforcement perspective, I give what I believe is the problem. There is always a problem between community and law enforcement. And there's a bigger problem between community of color and law enforcement. And there is an even a bigger problem of law enforcement and our immigrant community. And I can speak on all of them because I'm in my 37th year of law enforcement. And in Charlotte, we had a problem. And we had a lot of problems. And if you're familiar with the epidemic of crack cocaine, that was a huge problem in Charlotte in the 90s. So I worked a lot of murders, and I worked, luckily I have a nice clearance rate. But it would probably, and I joke about this, it could have been higher, but imagine being shot at, robbed nightly, and can't report it. But you go to work every day. Imagine being robbed, shot at, and sexually assaulted and can't report it. Imagine being robbed, shot at, sexually assaulted, and murdered, and you can't report it. That's when I came in. I have 5 open murders in Charlotte against immigrants that are still open to this day. I have 45 witnesses on 1 case. And most of the witnesses are immigrants, but they say they can't talk to me. They can't give me their name, they can't give me their address, they can't give me anything. Although I can say, if you can just cooperate, I know who did it. Just verify it, they won't. The biggest thing that came for me a couple of years ago, and there's 2 things, and I thought the doctor was going to touch on one, because I follow this. And I'm sure that everybody knows that there's a young lady who was killed in a city by an immigrant, and it's nationally known. But you never heard about the sheriff deputy who repeatedly raped, young girls in this town in Texas, and finally the mother said, I'm tired. I'm going to walk my daughter to the fire department and tell the firemen, hoping that they will tell the police. And that's what they did, and they arrested the deputy, and in the middle of this, the deputy decided, while in his jail cell, to commit suicide. But then when you want to bring it home, Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department had an officer that took dishonor to the badge also himself and sexually assaulted 5 Latino women. They were afraid to report it. And finally, one did report it. And we charged him, and we convicted him, and he went to prison. But here's where it bothered me. A young lady called me and said, Gary, I got a problem with the young man who was just on TV. I'm sitting at my friend's house, and her daughter, who is 9 years old, all she knows is the man who came on TV was the same man who stopped her and her mother one night, and after her mother got back to the car, she was crying. So she asked her mother in front of the friend, Mommy, isn't that the man that made you cry? And she disregarded it. Her friend asked her what happened. She cannot report that sexual assault. She cannot report that rape. And she called me, and we tried to talk her to coming to talk, but she never did. So then what I asked someone, if you are an illegal immigrant and you are murdered, do I have to work that murder? Should I work that murder? Or are we going to say because that person is an illegal immigrant, I don't have to work that? I couldn't say that. I have to work it. I have a very good relationship with all communities in Charlotte. And that's what we miss. So we have to build the relationships between law enforcement and the entire community if we're going to move forward. But we are not getting that far because of what we have in Charlotte or what we still have in Charlotte now. And it's going to change in December of this year, the 3rd.
When you take over as sheriff, thank you. My next question is for Akan. In thinking about enforcement policies, we haven't talked much about the rhetoric on immigration and the impact it has on Muslims and more generally on America. Could you respond to that?
Yeah, thank you to the Riley Institute for having me, and thank you all for being here. One of the categories by which one can become an immigrant and a citizen that the keynote speaker left out in his wonderful speech is if you just come to visit and you meet someone and you fall in love and you get married and you stay. This is what happened to me. I'm a professor, so my response will be maybe slightly longer, but I'll try and make it short. In 2009, there was a big study came out of West Point Academy, and the media was attentive, and in the media it had the following headline: surprising study. Al-Qaeda kills 8 times more Muslims than it kills non-Muslims. It wasn't surprising to us Muslims at all. We know that very well. If you go and visit a Muslim community anywhere and you seek out, for example, the Syrian brothers and sisters there, you will likely find among them people who have loved ones right now in Syria, who have been running away either from the brutal dictator Bashar al-Assad or from ISIS. And many of them are dying in the process of running away or becoming refugees. What I want to say is the following, and this is important for us Americans to understand. Al-Qaeda or ISIS and the like, they're not enemies of the United States or not enemies of the West. They're enemies of humanity, of all of us. In fact, we Muslims are the front row victims. I think if we would understand this, then it perhaps would stand in the way of the rhetoric that we have been hearing, but it is not well understood. The rhetoric we're familiar with. In 2015, Ben Carson, running for presidency, declared, for example, that Muslim Americans should not be able to be president of this country because they would be more loyal to their religion than to America. Donald Trump circulated the idea of Muslims wearing a special ID, and so on. Of course, there was also very ugly rhetoric about Latinos, about Africans, and about many others. It is rather obvious, I think, what this rhetoric has been doing to us Muslims. In the first half of 2017, for example, hate crimes against Muslims have been going up by 91%. Also here in Greenville, we have experienced those hate crimes even long before, in the 90s, for example, when our mosque on Wade Hampton was burned down. They caught the person, and the person in his confession said it was Jesus who told him to do so. I don't think Jesus did that. But what is this doing to our country, this rhetoric? Let me try and explain this too. I came here from Germany, and given what I will be saying now, I want to be very clear. I love Germany very much. It's deep in here. I go there every year with my family, and we visit. Since the birth of our children, we have two, I've been speaking exclusively in German with them. We love Germany. But for us as immigrants in Germany, as Turks, it was also very difficult there because we were looked down upon. Our parents were uneducated, they were poor, that's why they came to Germany. We were stereotyped, we were prejudiced against, and stigmatized often. I still remember until today the word Turk was attached to my forehead like a stigma. And it was always through that stigma that people looked at me. In the 90s, I came to the United States. I landed in Tempe, Arizona. I was picked up by my Christian host family at the airport, stayed with them for the first few days to get oriented, met my professors at graduate school, at the university there. And after a few days, it didn't take long at all, I noticed something. And what I noticed, that stigma on my forehead, that Turk, that stigma was gone. And I remember today, that was the first time in my life when I felt I'm living without a stigma attached to me. People look at me not through a lens that colored their perception of me. And that was the first time in my life I felt free from a stigma. If you want to know what can make this country great, it's that. To give someone the feeling that he or she can be free. I attended the mosque in Tempe, Arizona. Next to it, you can look it up on the map, is a church. And next to it is a synagogue. It was like a perfect microcosm of coexistence, where you would stop and pause and think, in America only. To be sure, it's not only in America. But in America, we like to think this is what America is. This is what America is about. Some years later, I became a citizen. That happened in Charleston, South Carolina. That was the first time I was a citizen of a country that I lived in. I remember very well the ceremony because it was beautiful. There were so many people, 80, 90 of us. There were people from Asia, from Korea, from India, from Pakistan. There were people from various African countries. There were people from Latin America. There were Hispanics. There were Europeans, a Greek guy and an Italian guy sitting next to me. We went drinking coffee afterwards, fighting who will pay for the coffee. People were so exuberant, enthusiastic, taking photos with the immigration officer, feeling proud. That's America. That to me is America. And this I experience every time I visit a university campus, especially big universities. Sit on the campus and sip a coffee and the students walk by. And you realize there are students from Korea, there are students from China, there are students from Thailand, there are students from Mali, there are students from Egypt, there are students from Jordan, there are students from Mexico, there are students from Brazil. There are students from everywhere. You realize America is where the world is. And you realize, all these young people are here to make themselves better and then to make the world better. Here in America. America is the place for them to do it. You start realizing that America is much more than a country. It is also an idea. It is also an idea. And I think the idea is that no matter who you are, you can be and become better. That is for me the idea of America. America is the idea that I can say, this is mine as much as it is yours. And you can say the same. And nobody will stop you from saying so. Okay. The American idea, I think, has to do with acceptance, with inclusion, with equality, with opportunity, with justice. Now, this idea of America that I'm describing here is not always the reality of America. Native Americans notice. African Americans notice. Latinos notice. Catholics notice. Jews notice. Muslims notice. And many more notice. I think the task of American citizenship, that is what it means for me to be American and to be Muslim American. The task of citizenship is to make the idea of America ever more the reality of America for ever more people. That's the task of citizenship, to make the idea of America ever more the reality of America. Currently, we're going in the wrong direction. Very much so. I'd like to think of America in terms of a book in progress, in which each chapter must carry more equality than the preceding one. Each chapter must carry more beauty, more justice than the preceding chapter. And that must always define the book of America. Every succeeding chapter is better than the preceding chapter. The best days of America are ahead of us. Okay. This is not the chapter that is currently being written, I regret to say. It's in opposition. The rhetoric that we're hearing is in opposition. The chapter that we're writing is in opposition to the American idea. And so I think, and that's what I like to tell my students, it is our task to write a better one. And I think we will. Thank you.
Thank you, Akan. I'd like to go back to Neil. South Carolina is a red state, Neil. Often elections are won in the primary rather than the general election. You won your Republican district primary despite the angry cries protesting your, quote, liberal views. Tell us why you, as a conservative, think we should educate all our residents and offer them skilled jobs, even if they are here undocumented.
Well, thank you. Yes, I represent Easley in Pickens County. Do we have any Pickens County people here by chance? All right. We have a few. I like to say that we're arguably the most conservative county and arguably the most conservative state in the nation, so I represent some very conservative people. I also think that I am probably one of the most conservative people in this room right now. There might be some ideal guys and girls in attendance tonight that I used to be, and I've had to wane a little bit. But that being said, I hope that it's an example of, one, the current rhetoric that we are hearing is not and does not represent the conservative viewpoint from my standpoint, and I believe many, many others. So that first being said. Number two, it's an example of, even in the reddest district in our reddest state, you can listen to people, you can listen to topics, and you can make, in my viewpoint, conservative judgments on that. And again, specifically to legal status dreamers, yes, in my viewpoint, we invest, and it's a return on investment to me of those $12,000 over potentially 12 years. For us to put up obstacles for them not to continue their education makes no conservative sense to me. For them not to be able to obtain an occupational license in a field that we desperately need in a growing state makes no conservative sense to me. Being able to get them to have higher paying jobs to where they're paying more taxes to us makes no conservative sense to me, not allowing that. So it's all in how, as an attorney, we have to frame the argument, and unfortunately, our leader of my party, at least, has framed the argument in a horrendous framing. In Pickens County, I think he got, well, I know he didn't get 100%. I know he had at least one vote against him. But he was very close, and he won the argument. And it's up to, honestly, it's up to leaders in the right now in the Republican Party, since it's right now in the majority, but we may get a necessary whipping here in November, maybe. But it's up to us to be bold and be able to go in front of crowds and say, no, we can make a conservative argument. We can talk about American ideals in a different way.
Thank you, Neil. Gary, one reason you won the election is because you promised to end 287G. Why did you promise to end it?
Well, for me, and I want to thank Brother Neil, I think we lost a very unbelievable maverick, but I think South Carolina has another one. I just want to say that. And I really mean that. 287G did nothing for us. That's where I'm going to get in trouble. 287G, I will fight it, I will talk about it, because I think 287G was designed to do something, and it didn't. If anybody want to see the numbers. When we're talking about gangs, everybody know MS-13, that's all you know. You hear about that. But does gang members really do all the violence in America? Or do we have all this violence in America caused about immigrants? And can those numbers be shown? Well, I will tell you, Homeland Security has a report out there in the 2017 report. I want you to take a look at it when you go home. So when we think that they're decreasing safety and violence of America, and here's what they did, where I'll look at my numbers. Last year, 2017, they arrested 335 immigrants for murder. Woo. But they arrested 20,000 for DUI. So where are the efforts going? So if you arrest this young man for DWI and arrest this young man for homicide and put them in the same cell, we're taking the same money to take care of both of these guys and send them back across. If you look at the numbers again, you know, you come down. Communicating threats. I think everybody in here has probably done threatened somebody one time or another. So did it really work? And I'm not saying, you know, I know the doctor said that he's not against abolishing ICE, and I'm not either. But then there's a letter out there that 16 agents said, hey, we're not doing the right thing. Can we look at this again? And then we have to talk about lawsuits. I'm walking into a lawsuit when I get back to Charlotte that my counterpart had there, and they lost the suit because of detainers and holding people in jail. And so I'm going to have to defend that or do something. He appealed it already. So what if I just say, y'all won, I'm going to take the appeal off? And here's why, and some of the things that they don't tell you, that if they sue Greenville for having people in jail, ICE does not defend you. It's your money who's going to defend that. ICE 287 is just an agreement. It is not the law. It's an agreement to say, while you don't want to do, and here's what I say to people candidly. Federal government works federal government stuff. I work county stuff. You handle that. If you need more agents, take 2 rows of bricks off the wall. And that'll pay for your agents. But what they do is actually send people, we pick these people up, our officer put them in jail, and while they're in their beds at home, they said, hey, we got these 2 guys, okay, we got 48 hours, and they bring down a detainer. A detainer is not a warrant. They said, we want you to detain this guy, and we're going to have 48 hours and send him back. And then all kind of stuff happens. And then what if something happens to that guy? You know where it ends up? On our plate. They don't tell you that. But this is what I want to say. So then when we look at the numbers and all that other stuff, I had some other things written here. And here's what it does also when we talk about 287G. And this is actually what happens. Mom and dad gets picked up because of 287G, leave 4 high school students alone. So you have to think about it. If the ICE van is going by the street and mom and dad are at the grocery store and they pick up mom and dad from the grocery store and they take them down to the ICE headquarters, they call the house and said, we have your mom and dad. And they're all 4 students in high school. Who takes care of those 4 students? What happened to those 4 students? What is going to happen to those 4 students? Now we can talk about MS-13 because we got 4 students trying to fend for themselves because their parents are in jail. So then, you know, Juan from MS-13 said, if you want to survive, let me tell you to do this, let me tell you to do that, and then you get into the gang, and then they remain here because they are U.S. citizens. So all I was telling them is, get your stuff right, handle your own cases, and we'll be fine. You know, you're the federal government, I'm just the local guys. And we'll handle ours and we'll handle yours, and you know, we'll still have the badge and I'll still respect you. When I had the meeting with ICE, I not only asked for the local agent and the regional agent, I asked for the big boys. And I said, driving from Atlanta if you want to have a conference with me. And we had a conference at the table. And we shook hands. I said, now we can all live here peacefully, but understand this. The Mecklenburg County Jail is mine. And if you want to enter there, you go by my rules and not your rules. And so it was designed to do a lot, but I don't think they have it right. And so until you get it right, I don't need it. If it ever comes back and it's right, like the doctor said, and we don't abolish it, then I may look at it. But it's not good for me.
Thank you. My last question is for Khan. The title of our series is Who Gets to Be an American? How would you answer that?
Yeah, who gets to be, can you still hear me? Who gets to be American? I think we like to think that people who come here legally and go through the formal process, they get to be American. Legally they do, yes, but to me that's really not the interesting part. The interesting part to me is on the experiential level. And there it can be quite a different story. It can be a different story because you can be a citizen, but still very much looked down upon, still discriminated against, and still being denied the dignity and the respect that you would be deserving. The term second-class citizen has a reality to it, indeed. Now, Muslims have been immigrating to America since the 16th century, involuntarily, as part of the transatlantic slave trade. These immigrants were part of building America, yet their salaries were never paid. And of course, they didn't get to be American. And many of their descendants, being American now, know the term second-class citizen because they live it every day. So Muslims have been an integral and productive and constructive part of America for a long time, but that's not how the public sees it. In 2016, Pew did a poll. The following question was asked: how many Muslims in the US, if any, are anti-American? How many Muslims in the US, if any, are anti-American? 53% of Americans responded about half or some Muslims are anti-American. And out of those, 12% responded almost all Muslims or most Muslims are anti-American. Muslims are often being seen as being anti-American, as being not patriotic, as not being equally American. I think other immigrant groups could tell you of similar feelings. Yes, they are American legally, formally, but they often feel a second-class citizen. And even people who are not immigrants but belong to a racial or ethnic minority can tell you about similar feelings. I think the question of who gets to be American has a lot of depth to it. And we should go into that depth. I think it's primarily a moral mandate to do so, but of course it's also a socio-political and an economic question why we should go in depth. Why is it a socio-political and economic question? Well, if we just take as an example any company or any corporation or any workplace, take Furman, take me as Furman. Oh, if I would not feel to be part of Furman, if I wouldn't feel that I could say this is mine as much as this is yours, if I wouldn't feel integrated, if I wouldn't feel part of it, then I would also come to withdraw myself and to alienate myself and become alienated and become isolated. And as a result, I would not bring to this enterprise the good things that I can bring to it to help Furman advance ever further and become ever better and ever more successful. And as a result, I also won't get the salary increase that I would be getting otherwise. So you see, it's an economic question. Why is it a moral mandate for us to think deeply about the question of this conference, who gets to be American? I think that is rather obvious. I think it only when everybody, or at least ever more, feel as first-class citizen, that we realize the idea of America ever more. And that's upon each one of us, I think. Thank you.
Thank you, Alkan. Okay, we have used up all of our time. I don't know if we've got enough minutes left to ask one or two questions from the audience. What do you think? Okay, let's get a couple of questions from the audience for any one of our participants. I see a hand back there, a hand there. Let's go over here. Can somebody, yeah.
I would like to make two brief statements before I ask my question. Number one, I came over here from Germany, so I'm an immigrant also. I have to emphasize now that I'm a legal immigrant often, kind of. Number two is walls don't work. Believe me, I come from Germany, walls do not work at all. And number three, Hakan, you old Turk, that was a good speech, man. My question is, why does nobody talk about the history of legal and illegal immigration? I remember from history lessons that in the 70s, especially in the 50s, I'm sorry, especially California was happy to get a lot of seasonal workers over there. We came in with a seasonal worker certificate. They could stay for 6 months and they went back. That was cancelled because that was too legal for many of the employers because they couldn't treat them as slaves. They had to pay them the full amount of money. So illegal workers were brought in with help of government and with help of companies because you just pay them a quarter of the salary. You can kick them in and out and around ever you want to. And it is super cheap. And we still have companies which are doing this in the food processing industry and so forth. Nobody ever talks about the responsibilities of the companies to stop this kind of practice and to help to hire those people when they want that the legal way. Why is nobody talking about that?
Well, I talk about it in my American immigration history course. So come and sit in on it. But yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And I think the best example of that is the Bracero program. The Americans have a history of bringing Mexicans in when they need them and then sending them back when we don't want them any longer. This went on for decades with Mexican workers. So you're absolutely right. One more question. Over here.
My question was for Steve. Is E-Verify absolute? Because I had roommates that worked for McDonald's, and I looked it up, and it was, at that time, it was like, if you had like over 50 workers, you had to participate. Is it absolute now?
Well, there are two questions. One is who may use it, and the other is who must use it. In terms of who may use it, any employer may use it, but there are two different obligations under E-Verify. One is that for employer sanctions, you can't knowingly hire any any worker who is not authorized to work. That's absolute. There are a couple of qualifications to it, but no real exceptions. The other is you have to go through certain paperwork to verify that the person you're about to hire is eligible to work. So E-Verify is one instrument that is used for an employer to perform those procedures. Right now, in general, it is optional for all employers, but there are some states in which laws have been passed that say state employers, and in some cases even private employers, must use it. But for the vast majority of U.S. employers, it is completely optional.
Thank you so much, everyone, and please join us next week when Ken Peterson will be talking about the economics of immigration. Thank you so much. Thank you.